There's a particular sensation that emerges when you realize you've been watching your life instead of living it. It doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic moment of recognition. You simply notice, perhaps while sitting in familiar silence, that something has shifted. Or more accurately, that something never quite arrived in the first place. You are present, technically. Your body occupies space. Your eyes register the room. But somewhere between perception and experience, a gap has formed. You are here, and yet you are observing being here. The difference is subtle and total. This isn't depression. It isn't dissociation in the clinical sense. It's more fundamental than that. You have replaced direct experience with the narration of experience. Life has become something you think about rather than something you inhabit. And the troubling part, the part that resists easy resolution, is that this substitution happened so gradually, so reasonably, that you cannot identify the moment it began. The mind learned to commentate, and somewhere in that process, the commentary became louder than the thing being observed. The transformation happens in layers, not all at once. You begin, as everyone does, with direct contact with the world. A child doesn't analyze hunger. They feel it, demand resolution, and move on. There's no narrative overlay, no story being constructed about what the hunger means or how it reflects on their character. The experience arrives, peaks, and dissolves without residue. But the mind, over time, develops a different relationship with experience. It begins to recognize patterns. It learns that certain sensations precede certain outcomes, that emotions contain information, that the world operates according to discernible rules. This is adaptation, not pathology. The ability to abstract from immediate experience and project forward is what allowed humans to survive, to plan, to build civilizations. The problem emerges not from the capacity itself, but from what happens when this capacity becomes the default mode of engagement with reality. At some point, and this point varies for everyone, though it often coincides with early self-awareness, experience stops being something you have and becomes something you evaluate. A conversation is no longer simply a conversation. It becomes material for analysis. You're not just speaking with another person, you're simultaneously monitoring your own performance, predicting their reactions, rehearsing better versions of what you should have said. The actual exchange and the living moment of connection becomes secondary to the mental reconstruction happening in parallel. Emotions undergo the same transformation. Sadness arrives, and immediately the mind begins its work. Why am I sad? What does this sadness reveal about me? Is this sadness justified, or am I being irrational? How long will this last? The feeling itself becomes background noise to the examination of the feeling. You are no longer sad. You are someone who is observing themselves being sad, which is an entirely different state of being. This mental translation process extends to everything. You don't watch a sunset. You think about watching a sunset, wonder if you're appreciating it correctly. Compare it to other sunsets. Consider how you might describe it later. The present moment becomes a rough draft for future reflection. Experience becomes conceptual before it has a chance to be felt. The consequences of this shift are not obvious at first. You don't suddenly collapse under the weight of constant mental activity. In fact, from the outside, nothing appears wrong at all. You function, you meet obligations, you participate in the expected rhythms of life. But beneath the surface, something essential has been muted. There's a specific quality to this condition that's difficult to name. It's not quite numbness, because you still feel things. It's not exactly detachment, because you care about outcomes. It's closer to living behind glass. Everything is visible, technically accessible, but there's a transparent barrier between you and direct contact. You reach for experiences and find that your hand passes through them without resistance, without texture. Life feels like watching a film of your own existence, one that you're simultaneously starring in and observing from a removed distance. The intensity drains out of things gradually enough that you don't notice until it's gone. Moments that should carry weight pass through you without leaving an impression. You attend events that once excited you and feel nothing in particular. Not disappointment, that would require enough emotional investment to be let down. just a quiet flatness, a sense that you're going through motions whose significance you've forgotten. People tell stories, and you hear the words without absorbing their meaning. You respond appropriately. You maintain the social contract, but the exchange doesn't penetrate. It remains external, conceptual, something happening to the idea of you rather than to the actual you. What makes this condition particularly insidious is that the mind offers compensation. It cannot provide genuine experience, but it can provide the simulation of understanding. You may not feel your life directly, but you can certainly think about it with great sophistication. You can analyze your relationships, construct elaborate frameworks for why you feel the way you do, develop detailed theories about your own psychology. The mind becomes more articulate precisely as lived experience becomes more distant. You gain the ability to explain yourself in increasingly complex ways while simultaneously losing touch with what there is to explain. And because this mental activity feels productive, because it resembles insight, because it uses the language of self-awareness, it's easy to mistake it for actual presence. You tell yourself you're being introspective when you're actually just creating more distance. The thought "I am disconnected from my life" becomes another thought to analyze, another object to examine, rather than a recognition that might lead somewhere different. Martin Heidegger spent much of his philosophical work circling around a deceptively simple question: what does it mean to exist? Not to think about existence, not to have theories about being alive, but to actually be. He recognized that humans had developed a peculiar talent for mistaking reflection about life for life itself. We had become, in his framework, so absorbed in analyzing our existence that we had forgotten how to simply be present within it. Heidegger distinguished between what he called beings, the objects and concepts we think about, and being itself, the fundamental condition of existing that precedes and underlies all our mental categories. When you think about your life, you are treating it as a being, as an object of analysis. You step outside of the living process and examine it from a distance, as if your existence were something separate from you, something that could be evaluated and understood through intellectual effort. But being, in Heidegger's sense, cannot be grasped this way. It is not an object to be studied. It is the ground from which all experience emerges, and you cannot step outside of it to examine it without fundamentally altering what you are trying to see. The danger, he identified, was that modern life pushes us further and further into this analytical stance. We become experts at categorizing, interpreting, and theorizing about our own existence while losing the ability to inhabit it directly. We live in a constant state of self-observation, treating ourselves as projects to be understood and optimized, rather than as beings who simply are. This doesn't make us more self-aware, it makes us more removed. The more sophisticated our self-analysis becomes, the further we drift from immediate contact with our own lives. What Heidegger understood, and what remains relevant now, is that thinking about being is not the same as being. You can spend years constructing elaborate mental models of who you are and what your life means, and none of that intellectual work brings you closer to the direct experience of existence. In fact, it often does the opposite. The mind, when left to its own devices, will always choose analysis over presence because analysis gives it something to do. Presence requires the mind to relinquish control, to stop commenting and categorizing, and that feels like dissolution rather than insight. When the possibility first emerges that you might stop living in constant mental narration, the response is rarely relief. It's closer to vertigo. The idea of existing without the mind's continuous interpretation feels less like freedom and more like falling. Because thought, for all its limitations, provides something crucial: distance. And distance, however isolating, feels safer than direct exposure to the rawness of unmediated experience. The mind offers a buffer between you and reality. When something painful happens, thought allows you to step back, to analyze rather than absorb, to construct explanations that make the pain comprehensible and therefore manageable. When something unpredictable occurs, thought gives you the illusion of control. You may not be able to change what happened, but you can at least organize it into a coherent narrative, fit it into your understanding of how things work. This buffer becomes so familiar that you forget it's there. You assume that the distance between you and your life is just how experience works, that everyone lives with this same layer of mental translation mediating their contact with reality. The prospect of removing that buffer, even temporarily, triggers a specific kind of anxiety. Without the mind's constant interpretation, what remains? If you stop analyzing your emotions, will you be overwhelmed by them? If you stop rehearsing conversations before they happen, will you say something irreparably wrong? If you stop evaluating your experiences as they occur, how will you know whether you're doing life correctly? The questions themselves reveal how deeply the mind has convinced you that its management is necessary, that without constant surveillance and commentary, everything will collapse into chaos. But there's something else beneath the anxiety, something the mind doesn't want you to notice. Thought creates the illusion of protection, but what it actually provides is avoidance. By staying in your head, you avoid the vulnerability of being fully present with another person, the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next, the discomfort of feeling something you cannot immediately categorize or resolve. The mind keeps you busy with analysis, prediction, and retrospection, and in that busyness, you never have to fully land in the present moment. You never have to be completely here, exposed to whatever arises without the safety net of mental commentary. This is why stepping out of thought doesn't feel like liberation at first. It feels like losing the only tool you've ever trusted. The mind has been running the show for so long that the idea of existing without its mediation seems impossible, even dangerous. And so you stay in thought not because it makes you happy, but because the alternative, direct, unfiltered contact with life as it actually is, feels too destabilizing to tolerate. The shift, when it happens, doesn't resemble the dramatic transformations described in spiritual literature. There's no blinding insight, no sudden dissolution of the thinking mind, no permanent state of clarity that descends and remains. What occurs is far more subtle, almost disappointingly ordinary. You simply find yourself, for a moment or perhaps longer, existing without the usual mental overlay. The commentary stops, not because you forced it to stop, but because something in you stopped feeding it. You might be walking, and suddenly the act of walking is just walking. Not walking while planning what you'll say later, not walking while replaying an earlier conversation, not walking while maintaining the internal monologue about how you feel about walking. Just the physical sensation of movement, the contact between foot and ground, the rhythm of breath, the peripheral awareness of surroundings. The experience is so simple that it barely registers as significant, and yet something fundamental has changed. You are in your body instead of hovering slightly above it in observation mode. Or you're speaking with someone, and for the first time in longer than you can remember, you're not simultaneously monitoring your performance. You're not calculating how you're being perceived, not editing your words before they emerge, not preparing your next response while the other person is still talking. You're just there, in the exchange, responding from some place that precedes thought rather than filtering everything through mental rehearsal first. The conversation doesn't become profound or particularly memorable. It's just an actual conversation, unmarked by the usual layer of self-consciousness that makes every interaction feel like a performance you're giving and critiquing at the same time. The world doesn't change. Colors don't become more vivid. Sounds don't take on mystical significance. Ordinary objects don't suddenly reveal hidden depths. What changes is that the constant narrative interpretation falls away, and what's left is just direct contact. A door is a door, not a symbol or a metaphor or a reminder of something else. A moment of silence is simply silence, not an uncomfortable gap that needs to be filled or analyzed or explained. Everything becomes exactly what it is, stripped of the layers of meaning and significance the mind constantly projects onto it. This state doesn't last, or more accurately, you don't stay in it. The mind, after a period of quiet, reasserts itself. Thoughts return, the commentary resumes, and you find yourself back in the familiar mode of experiencing life through the filter of continuous mental interpretation. But something has shifted nonetheless. You now know, not intellectually but through direct experience, that another way of being is possible. That the constant thinking is not inevitable, not structural, not who you fundamentally are. It's something the mind does, and like anything the mind does, it can stop. What you notice afterward is not that life has become easier or more pleasant, but that when you're not thinking about your life, you're actually in it. The distance collapses. Not permanently, not in some transcendent way that solves everything, but temporarily, in moments that feel surprisingly normal. You realize you've been living in a kind of translation, experiencing everything secondhand through the mind's interpretation, and that occasionally, without effort or technique, the translation stops and direct experience becomes available again. The return to thought is not a failure of discipline or a lack of commitment to presence. It's structural, built into the way human consciousness operates and the way the world is organized. The mind reasserts itself because thinking serves functions that presence cannot. It plans, it protects, it navigates social complexity, it solves problems that require abstraction and projection. A life lived entirely without thought would be a life incapable of functioning in the structures that define modern existence. And so thought returns, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a tool that has forgotten it's a tool and believes itself to be the entirety of who you are. The world reinforces this return constantly. Every institution you interact with rewards analytical thinking and punishes presence. Your job doesn't care whether you're experiencing the moment directly. It cares whether you're planning, strategizing, optimizing, projecting outcomes. Your relationships, especially those outside deep intimacy, function through social scripts that require you to monitor yourself, to think about how you're being perceived, to manage impressions. Even your internal sense of progress and achievement depends on the mind's ability to measure, compare, and evaluate. Presence offers no metrics. It doesn't produce anything the world recognizes as valuable. Beyond external pressure, there's an internal pullback toward thought that's difficult to resist. The mind is comfortable. It's familiar territory, however unsatisfying. You know how to operate in thought. You've built an entire identity around your mental activity, around the particular way you think about yourself and interpret your experience. Stepping out of that, even briefly, creates a disorientation that feels like losing yourself rather than finding something more fundamental. The mind offers certainty, even when that certainty is uncomfortable. It tells you who you are, what everything means, how you should respond. Presence offers none of that. It offers only direct contact with what is, without interpretation, and that can feel like standing in a void. So you return to thought not because you failed at presence, but because the mind is designed to pull you back. It generates new problems to solve, new scenarios to analyze, new versions of yourself to examine and improve. It creates urgency around things that don't require urgency, importance around things that don't matter, and meaning around experiences that simply are. And because this mental activity feels productive, because it gives you something to do, it's easier to engage with it than to rest in the simplicity of direct experience. There's no resolution to offer here, no technique that will permanently quiet the mind, no practice that will keep you in presence once you've found it. That would be another thought, another framework, another way of turning life into a project to be managed. What remains instead is a simple recognition. The distance between you and your life is not fixed. It's optional, not in the sense that you can choose to eliminate it forever, but in the sense that it's not as solid as it appears. The mind will continue doing what it does. It will narrate, analyze, interpret, project. That's its nature, and there's no war to be won against it. But underneath that constant activity, there's something else. A capacity to exist without commentary, to be present without the need to understand or explain what presence means. You've likely touched this state without naming it, in moments when thinking simply wasn't necessary, when life was immediate enough that the mind had nothing to add. The question that lingers is not how to achieve this permanently, but whether you can recognize when you've slipped back into living entirely in thought. Can you notice the difference between experiencing something and thinking about experiencing it? Can you feel the gap when it forms, that subtle removal from direct contact, without immediately trying to fix it or understand why it happened? The noticing itself is not the same as presence, but it's what makes presence possible again. Life doesn't feel different because it becomes something other than what it is. It feels different because you stop standing between yourself and it. The commentary stops being the primary experience, and what's actually happening becomes available again. Not better, not worse, not more meaningful, just closer, just real in a way that thought can describe, but never quite reach. If this exploration resonated with something you felt but haven't found words for, subscribe to continue examining what remains invisible in plain sight. These patterns don't reveal themselves in the noise. They require the kind of attention that waits, watches, and refuses easy answers. Thank you for staying until the end. Not everyone can sit with ideas that offer no immediate resolution. The fact that you did suggest you understand that some questions matter more than their answers.